still big on my name.
I kind of gathered that from.
Well, like this morning, like they said her name and she made me bigger than the town, when that whole group was right there, before devotions. I'm just like, come on, let it go. Life's short.
Is it to everyone?
It was, there were about 6 or 7 people there.
Sure, she didn't just not hear them, or?
I mean, it wasn't my name and I heard it.
Oh, you did, okay.
I mean, usually you hear your own name
I suppose.
more than other people hear your name.
Well, that's, too bad.
She said it's really awkward because it's just 3 of them in the Call of the Wild group, so it's Maggie and Tori and I don't know who the other one is. I bet that's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I can imagine that's really kind of weird.
Did you fix the screen? It looks a little better.
No. It does look a little better, though.
Yeah, it does.
prefer if you left them the way that they are.
That's like not an okay thing.
No?
I knew it. That's like worse than being a bad person. Yeah. That's
Maggie.
like being a terrible person.
Please.
That's like a white piece of paper. I just threw away.
Guys, please don't turn over your sheets of paper just yet.
It's like another test thingy that you gave us.
What's that?
Is it like a surprise quiz? Is it a surprise quiz? Is it? It is. Look, it is. It is a surprise quiz. It is a surprise quiz.
Is it great?
Not a surprise anymore.
What about yesterday? What about all this stuff on the board? What about everybody talking except for like 4 or 5 people? But you listened intently respectfully, while your classmates spoke, right?
Is it great?
We'll talk about it as soon as everybody's good, okay?
I got more candy.
Sharon might break if you make it work. It's basically what you think.
Wait, what?
I didn't switch the third. No, do not eat that one.
Where?
Stop. No.
Okay, guys, everybody take a seat. Flip over your quizzes. It's 5 questions. There's nothing to be scared of. Yes, it is graded.
Oh no.
A couple of these terms you should know from the 3rd grade, guys. So don't freak out. Please just put your name on it. Take, I don't know, maybe the next 5-7 minutes to try and finish these up. I'll give a brief definition and how it applies to what we talked about just yesterday.
Are we allowed to use our notes?
No. When you guys are done, just put them on my desk, please. I know you're not cheating, Peyton, and it's a really bad habit to speak while you're taking a quiz. Other teachers might think that you're cheating. I don't. Haley, did you have a question about the quiz? Besides what is the answer to number 2?
No, it's not that.
What?
I was just thinking, I thought the tariff thing happened in group 4's tariff and combinations, and we didn't get to that.
Definition of the word tariff.
Not how it applies?
Just the definition.
Just go with the definition. If all you can do is give me a definition of these words, that's better than just doing nothing. We haven't talked about it yet.
Mr. H, how
Yep.
much is each, like, question?
We'll go over that as soon as you guys are done. It'll take like 3 or 4 more minutes, guys. Okay, guys, 1 more minute. Ten more seconds. Okay, guys, put your pens or pencils down. Finish up your last thought, and show your quizzes up on my desk, please. What's that? Okay, I'm sure it'll be better than reading a bad answer. Okay, guys, so there's no reason to really worry about the quiz. It's worth 5 points. So, but, yeah, just 1 per. The correctly point out that we haven't really gone over tariff yet, but does anybody, we're just going to go through this real quick. We'll start with tariff, kind of backwards.
There was a tax put on British goods, the tariff for the tax.
Tariff, if you just wanted to give me a very basic definition, another word for tariff, tax. Perfect. How about anybody but, I think you had caucus, so I don't want you to answer that. Peyton, go ahead.
Private meeting?
Private meeting, right? And in this particular case, what we talked about yesterday, what did they decide in those private meetings? Someone besides Carter?
I
Alex?
feel like the next president was gonna be or the controller of the.
Exactly. I mean, yeah, they were, caucuses got together, and we still use that word a lot. I think there's an Iowa caucus. So when people run for president, some states have primaries and some states have caucuses still to this day. But the caucus they use, say for example, in the state of, I think Iowa is a state that still does a caucus. It's nothing like the caucus that they're referring to at this time. Remember, it's just kind of like the political elite deciding who the next political elite is going to be.
Didn't they decide not to do that?
I'm sorry?
Didn't they decide not to do that?
Right, you remember that's kind of related to what we were talking about because they did away with it, and Andrew Jackson is considered to be the people's first president, and that kind of ties into the next term, democracy. Does anybody have like a definition or how it applies? Carter, go ahead.
That's like where the people have the ability to choose who their leader is gonna be.
Have a say in their government, right? That it's not just, it's not aristocratic, it's not decided by a political elite, it's decided by poor farmers in a lot of instances, because you remember before, in previous elections, you needed to what? You needed to be, first of all, white, of course, right, and male, and what was the other thing that you needed to do to be able to vote? Delia?
Well, before this, they needed their own land.
Right, you needed to be a landowner. And so by this time, there were even some states in, you remember we said New England, they allowed what group of people to vote if they own land? Peyton? African Americans, right? So this is the 1820s. And we tend to think that, oh, African Americans didn't have the right to vote until long after the Civil War. And for some of them, that's true. Or with the passing of the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment, everything tied to anti-slavery and then actually giving them rights. So, very good. Veto. Brandon.
Rejection or do that.
Who vetoes? Does anybody know where you hear about a veto taking place? Mia?
Well, the president vetoes, like, if there's a law, that's trying to be passed, it has to come up to him final, and if he vetoes it, it has to go back to the Congress, I want to say.
Exactly. So there's this whole process in order to be able to pass legislation, right? If you go, it's not necessarily created in, oh, the boss is here, we all better behave. But it's not necessarily created by the president. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's created by legislators in the House of Representatives or the Senate, right? And so the president has final say on a lot of things. So if everybody just decided, say, in a Republican-run House of Representatives that they wanted to push a bill through, and it was completely opposed to the kinds of things that Barack Obama wanted, do you think when it got to his desk, you think he would sign off on it because a whole bunch of Republican legislators had been able to pass it through the Senate? So he's got the power of veto. And how does it apply to what we talked about yesterday with Andrew Jackson? Peyton?
He vetoed the Bank of the United States.
Yeah, the Bank of the United States put a charter through before his election in order to try and make sure that he wouldn't veto it, thinking that he would lose support. And he vetoed it anyway. So this is during his second election. But he basically killed the Bank of the United States. Does anybody remember what one of the consequences of that was, Bryson?
We went into kind of a depression.
And that was during whose term?
Jackson.
It wasn't during Jackson's term. It's called the Panic of 1837. Who's president after Andrew Jackson? He's called Little Magician Delia. Martin Van Buren, right? And so he dealt with a lot of the consequences of some of the policies that Jackson had actually implemented at the time. And some of these things we haven't gotten to, but it was under Van Buren's administration that the Trail of Tears took place. So we're going to get back to that. I know there's a couple groups that, or there's one group that needs to finish up and one group that hasn't even talked yet about some of the things that we were going to talk about yesterday. Last one I have on here is, like I said, we're working backwards, spoil system. Does anybody know that one?
I have it in my notes.
Do notes, do you guys remember when I showed you that slide of Andrew Jackson and he had like wings and he was like a demon and he was like the puppeteer? Do you remember?
That's
Do you, well, here, I'll show it.
that one wrong.
This one.
I didn't.
It was all the spoil system. Think you're spoiled. Go ahead.
The spoil system is basically getting rid of a bunch of qualified people in office
Right?
and giving it to whoever you like the most. Giving
And
it
they're
to-
willing to do kind of whatever you want them
Yeah.
to do, right? So you're able to spoil these people for supporting you, but it's kind of a give and take, right? It's kind of a reciprocal relationship. So that's what this slide was representing. So let's go ahead and get back to, I think you guys, right, we're going to present what you had on group 4, right? I think we still needed to hit the tariff of abominations and then the South Carolina nullifies. So I don't know who has, whichever one you guys want to present first. I guess the tariff of abominations, it would make more sense if we did that one first.
I'll just wait for
And you guys are going to be using our books today, so does everybody have the book? Miranda, if you need a book, oh, you got your book? Does everybody have their book? I have an extra if anybody needs it. Kevin, go ahead. We're always
Okay,
pressed for time in this
so,
class, so please go ahead.
Tariff of abominations is the highest tariff in history of our nation, which was in 1828. And the Southerners called it the tariff of abominations. And an abomination is something that's hated.
Right.
So,
Why do they call it an abomination? The tariff.
well, it kind of just hurt like Southern bankers. So it just like, it made, yeah, it just kind of hurt like people growing stuff in the South.
Exactly.
So-
What ended up happening is the federal government passed these taxes, these tariffs, and that's why I want you. That's why I had this on this very short quiz that we just took. So I want you guys to remember tariff equals tax when we're talking about it, especially during this period. And the federal government had passed legislation that would tax certain goods that would come into the United States, or certain goods that were traded within the United States. People in the South had basically put most of their money for investments into slavery, right? And so they could grow and expand the practice of slavery. They thought it was basically an attack on the people of the South, this tariff of abominations. But we'll get into that a little bit more and what the consequences of that were a little bit more when
Yes.
Peyton talks about South Carolina nullifies.
So John Calhoun, the vice president, encourages states to use their power to nullify this tax. And then Daniel Webster disagreed, and he wrote a speech about how if states had this high power, then the nation would fall apart. And they got into a fight. And then Calhoun ended up leaving the office because he hated everyone. And then South Carolina nullifies in 1832 and threatens to leave the Union if it doesn't happen, if the tax doesn't go away. And then the president, so Andrew Jackson, he changed the tariff to a lower price, and then he asked Congress to pass the force bill, which allowed him to use the army to enforce the tariff. And South Carolina ends up repealing the Nullification Act, and everything is fine.
So that's, I mean, she just gave you a ton of information, but it's called, does it say nullification crisis in your books? Does it use that term,
Yeah.
nullification
That's
crisis?
Nullification Act.
They use that, that's the main, the heading? Okay, no, that's totally fine. That's what this is known as a historical event, the nullification crisis. And I don't know if you guys were able to hear what she said when she first started talking about it, but it was John C. Calhoun, this guy, you've seen him before. You remember we said he looked like a what? A hawk. He was one of the war hawks with Henry Clay, I believe. And this is his picture. This is a vice president at the time.
That's kind of my.
Andrew Jackson is the president, right? And so he says he agrees to this tariff. Right? He could have vetoed it. We just talked about the power of the veto, but he agrees with taxing the states within the United States all the same. South Carolina, from where John C. Calhoun is from, he's his vice president, and he encourages the state of South Carolina to do what? To veto it. And then they threaten to do what if the federal government doesn't allow them to do it. So they basically say when we're going to we don't think that the federal government has the authority to tax us. We find this unconstitutional. So we will make the tax null and void. So think about the nullification crisis like that. If you don't like what the federal government passes in legislation, then you as states, it's your constitutional right to just say, we disagree with your tax and we find it null and void. But it's a huge crisis because, as Peyton correctly pointed out, Andrew Jackson is not the kind of guy that you want to mess with, right? He actually went to the government and said, I want to use troops against South Carolina if they actually try to secede from the Union, to break away from the Union. And I have read that he was prepared to have hundreds of thousands of troops in marching on South Carolina. So what does this amount to?
Civil War.
Civil War, that's exactly what it is. It's civil war. And so through this kind of handling, what did you say, Peyton, about how he, in order to, I guess, basically appease South Carolina, what did he do?
He lowered the tariff.
So the tariff, the people of South Carolina, especially people like John C. Calhoun, were ready to break away from the United States, become their own country or republic, whatever. And Andrew Jackson was ready to go to war. And through various negotiations, they finally just decided to lower the tax. And so there was no war. And that was the nullification crisis, that we were on the brink of civil war in the 1820s and the 1830s. South Carolina decided that they didn't have to, obey what federal mandates had been passed. Does anybody remember where the first shots of the Civil War were fired? The Civil War that we did fight under President Lincoln? In South
Mr.
Carolina.
Skimper does.
What's that?
Mr. Skimper does.
Oh, I'm not going to call on you today, sir. We'll let the kids do it.
I
Carter,
don't know the answer to that.
did you have a question from before? Okay, I just thought you did. Okay, so moving on to who had the last section. That was you guys. I need my glasses. What does it say at the top? Who's got the first point, I guess? Go ahead, Meg.
It's forceful removal, and it was when white people made the Indians move, and so the Indians really wanted to be friends with the white people, but the white people really wanted more land, and they thought that where the Indians were was a really nice place to be, and so they made more than 15,000 Cherokee Indians move, and they moved hundreds of miles in 7 months, and thousands died, and they were mostly children and elderly people.
How many did that? I'm sorry. How many did they move?
They moved more than 15,000 Cherokees.
Cherokees. Okay. Does it say where they moved them from?
The Mississippi area?
They actually moved them
No,
from
they moved them from that area over
west of the Mississippi. Yeah. And we'll get into this a little bit.
Wasn't that like a period too?
That's exactly what it is. Yeah. But what? Before we get to that, well, Carter, did you have a question?
No, never mind.
Okay. Before we get to that, let's just go through this real quick. Who had the second point? That was very good, man.
That was me, but not me.
Well, the Indian Removal Act is a little bit different
That's
than
when
the.
Jackson was like, took a stand against, taking the Indians off the land, but then went with Congress.
It's really weird how this all plays out. You're right. I mean, the forceful removal of the Cherokees, they were one of the last of the 5 civilized tribes. You remember, I'm going to turn off the lights for just a second so you guys can hopefully see this map that I have a little bit more clearly. The 5 civilized tribes, as they're called, include the Seminoles, Cherokees, the Creek Indians, the Chickasaws, and the Choctaws, as we said yesterday. And this gives an idea of where they were located. I think, Peyton, you asked at one point, I think it was last week, you said, aren't the Seminoles, isn't that like a football team? It is, Florida State. So when you hear Seminoles, think Florida. Cherokees were from Georgia. They're probably the best known example of what took place in Indian removal. So these are the lands that they lived on, and these are some of the routes that they took on foot, most of them on foot, with elderly people of the tribe and their children, and they're moved all the way out to modern day what state? Oklahoma. Does anybody know what it says on the license plates of Oklahoma? I don't either. I think it's like native land or something like that. But there's a lot of Native American tradition that goes along with that. So the Indian Removal Act is passed by Congress, and that takes place obviously before the Trail of Tears, right? Like they actually wanted to take appropriate political measures in order to get this stuff done. What ends up happening, this is so crazy, the Cherokees, which were some of the last people to be removed from their lands, go to the Supreme Court. And they say, we don't think that this is legal, we don't think that this is right, we think that we have constitutional rights to this land. And guess what the Supreme Court says? That's not what they said. So what's the only other option that they said?
Yes, you do.
Yes, you do. We totally agree with you. You have constitutional rights to this land. We don't have the right to forcibly remove you with the Indian Removal Act. Guess what Andrew Jackson says?
I don't care.
And that's why a lot of, well, basically, I don't care. That's a good paraphrase. He said, Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. So basically said the Supreme Court ruled this way, who's going to stop me? Is basically what he said as president. That's not the way things work anymore, but it's so strange that it goes back to this idea that he was the people's president. And a lot of people want to paint Andrew Jackson as a tyrant, as a murderer, and I think that you can make some strong arguments for that, but at the same time, when you think about the people that supported him, do you think that they were like, you know, I supported him on killing the banks, and I supported him on being a general in New Orleans, but I don't support him on this? Do you think that that was the general consensus among the people living in this area, or do you think they wanted the Indians gone? Right, so it's kind of like popular opinion. Get them off these lands. Gold was discovered in Georgia, so people wanted to move in and get these people out of here. So Supreme Court says under, it's called Worcester versus Georgia. It's in your books. And they ruled in favor of the Cherokees. And Andrew Jackson said, I don't know who said the paraphrase, but basically said, I don't care. John Marshall has made his decision, I'll let him enforce it. Okay, so then we have the forceful removal, and that basically is just the use of the federal government to get these people off of their lands. And before we go on to the next points, I just wanted to pull up some images. So this is Martin Van Buren,
I
the little
want those hair things on his face.
sideburns.
Sideburns.
Yes.
This is the guy that we were talking about before, named the Little Magician. Apparently, he was a wonderful politician, great diplomat, but he was the second vice president for Andrew Jackson. Who was the first?
Calhoun.
John C. Calhoun, right? And he wanted to do what with the taxes that the federal government had passed? Remember the nullification?
Nullify.
Make them null and void, right? Okay, so Indian removal actually takes place under Martin Van Buren, but a lot of the policies that Jackson had implemented, he dealt with. You remember we talked about the Depression or the Panic? Because Jackson had closed the banks and it turned out to be a huge debacle. So, Martin Van Buren, Indian Removal Act, Jackson's ignoring of that, and the forceful removal leads to, these are just images. Hopefully you're able to take some notes on this stuff if you feel so compelled with the lights off. But it's obviously a little bit more, these images are a little bit more powerful when the lights are off and you can see the picture clearly. So this is pretty clear cut, right? It says Trail of Tears on the bottom. There's a woman crying here. What are some other things that you noticed from this artwork?
The Indians have their full head dresses, right?
They have their what?
They're like costumes, not their costumes, their clothing.
What about their clothing?
That they just look all the same.
Oh,
Never mind, I
okay.
can make-
That, like their, like traditional dress, you mean? Is that what you're saying?
And then
Sure.
look at this.
Yeah, it looks like they're burying someone right there.
Right. Yep. So, and that was common. People would die along the way, along the trail of tears.
And then the cow looks very skinny.
Yeah, whatever they're taking, I didn't even notice that, but that's a really good point. Whatever they're taking along, they, you know, they barely have time to stop and graze. And there's very few beasts of burden, pack animals, horses, stuff like that that they're taking with them, right? What else do you notice? What's the majority of the people? What's their means of travel?
Walking.
They're walking, right? And you remember we just had that image
There's a lady.
from. How many of you feel like you could walk from here to here?
And look
You
at
know?
the route they took.
The other thing that a lot of people don't realize about the Trail of Tears is that it was in the winter. A large part of it, right? So again, you have ravens or crows, whatever, kind of, we get the idea that they're feeding on a dead body, right? So, I watched a pretty,
Ew, that is gross.
that's what wild animals do. So, I watched this special, and this woman, we may actually be able to watch a portion of it in the next couple of days here, but this woman said that the Cherokees had arrived in these new lands that the federal government had given them. By the way, why do you think they gave them Oklahoma? Anybody have any ideas as to why that might be? Bryce?
Because it was kind of in the middle of nowhere. It's in their standards and there's not much value to it.
Exactly. I mean, that's a really good point. Tons of people wanted to live in Georgia, right? Especially with the discovery of gold.
On the map.
Who
it
wants
was
to live
labeled-
in Oklahoma? Go ahead, Carter.
On the map, it was labeled like unorganized territory.
Right, it was still a territory, it wasn't a
There.
state yet. You remember you had to have, what was it, like 60,000
60,000.
people living in a territory in order to be able to apply for statehood. I don't even know, I don't think we probably even counted Native Americans as people at the time. I had a couple other images. Again, this is a little blurry, but there's a person, looks like they kind of have them in a burial shroud, and you can see that they weren't just like, hey, go that way and get off the land. They actually had members of the military along with them to make sure that you go there, and we're going to make sure you get there by gunpoint. Again, trudging through the snow, most everybody on foot. Oh, I forgot, I lost my train of thought there for a second. What I was going to say is I watched this really cool special, and this woman had talked about the people that went. So it wasn't like some people had to go, it was like everybody, all the Cherokees that were living in Georgia at the time, all the Choctaws, the Creeks, the Seminoles, and the Chickasaws, they all were relocated, they all had to go. The Cherokees are the most well-known example because of so many things that they changed within their culture in order to assimilate into quote-unquote European culture. Does anybody know that word, assimilate? Mia?
They like change their way of living.
Exactly, that is a perfect way to put it. They changed so that the people that surrounded them would accept them. A lot of native cultures didn't have languages, didn't have written languages, and the Cherokees developed that. We'll see that in just a second. But if you are in the part of this mass migration, right, who do you think is most likely to die on this journey? Valley?
Probably the elderly because they can't go as fast, and they're like, yeah.
The elderly, anybody else?
The young people.
Haley?
Keep the 7-foot kids.
Kids, right? So the old and the young. And so this woman put it, I think, really perfectly when I was watching. I didn't think about it like this, but she said, the Cherokees arrived in their new lands with having lost their past and having lost their future. You know what I mean? Their next generation were gone, and the generation that preceded them were also dead, left along the way. A lot of times, they didn't even have time to give them proper burials. But, let me see if I can find this image. So here's a burial, and I thought this was kind of an interesting image. Why do you is there anything that pops out to you guys about this image? Tori.
The cross.
And why is that interesting? I mean, why is that significant?
Because Native Americans weren't like, they didn't really believe in God, right?
They weren't,
So,
for the most part, they weren't Christians, right?
Catholicism or something?
I'm sorry?
Never mind.
No, what were you, that's all right, what were you?
Is it Catholicism? Like, didn't they bring that over or something?
Well, the Spanish, when they first arrived, brought over Catholicism, a version that I don't think most people appreciate or agree with, or hopefully adhere to today. But you know, a lot of tribes had their own religions that had been passed down for thousands of years. If you remember when we were saying that what Mia had said about assimilate, right? The Cherokees had changed their traditions. They opened schoolhouses. They developed, I think, in the early 1800s. They never had this before, but they developed. They decided because they wanted to assimilate, they wanted to maintain their lands, and they wanted to, assimilate into European culture, and so they developed a written language. This is the Lord's Prayer in Cherokee. This is something that if you were to visit tribes of Cherokees, it's not in your book, but I found this online. I thought this was really, really cool. So all these letters and symbols that we see, we can see there's a European influence, right? An alphabet that we can pick out the letter R here, that's an E, that looks sort of like a G, and a C, that's a D, and then they have their own symbols. So if you had visited the Cherokees in the 1800s, you wouldn't have seen this, and this is how you pronounce it. I'll give you 5 extra credit points if you can do that from memory by Friday.
Only 5?
Yeah, only 5.
Wait.
Miranda.
The guy who created the alphabet was a wait.
That's right. That is in your books. This isn't in your book. So what Miranda just said is that there was a person who took time to develop an alphabet, right? So again, they could assimilate and be more like the Europeans. They changed their dress. They cut their hair. They started worshiping Jesus. You know, they converted. They became Christians. And for some of them, not all of them, but many of them did. And that was so that they could just maintain their way of life and just leave us alone. These are our traditional lands. Thousands of years before you guys got here, we were already here. And remember, the Supreme Court said, yeah, you're right. That's cool. You guys should stay. And then Andrew Jackson says, no, he writes a letter to him and it starts, my friends, I'm sorry, but we can't live together. But that's what he refers to them as, my friends. So, math problem. Would you guys just quickly do this math? So your book says 15,000. Some of the figures are a little bit different. But can anybody, well, how about this? 1 extra credit point for whoever gets this correct first. Not on a calculator.
Ryan is in Oklahoma. Mr.
Julia has her hand up
He's
first.
a Cherokee.
Really?
He's such a huge
Julia, yeah,
influence there.
not 6,000. Annika,
Is it 3,750?
right, roughly. So Annika gets the extra credit point.
The whole entire extra credit.
It's 25%, you know, so I just wanted you guys to touch up on your math skills. I know they're pretty basic. But we'll do a couple of these kinds of exercises. Just like I said, I just have this heading here, historical data, because it kind of puts things in perspective. A lot of people, when they hear Trail of Tears, without even looking at it, they always think hundreds of billions and trillions of Native Americans. Well, that's not really true, but you got to consider how many of them were there that had to make this trip. 15,000 of them make the trip, and how many did you say? 3,750 or something like that?
Yeah.
If that many died, that's a huge chunk, right? 25% of your population. So it's really detrimental to them. Again, like I said, they lost They lost their past and they lost their future. Other natives that were moved out of their traditional lands were moved out of an area called the Northwest Territory. In places like, well, does anybody want to try and identify this weird looking shape up here? What states, modern day states would those be, Mia?
Michigan, Wisconsin, and or part of Minnesota.
In Ohio.
Indiana.
Illinois.
Illinois.
Anybody else?
Indiana, Ohio.
Montana.
What?
So yeah, you guys got them pretty much. I think there's a little tiny portion of Minnesota in there, but yeah. Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and then a bit of Minnesota. But isn't that kind of a weird? I thought that was really strange the first time that I heard that. The Old Northwest. Why would they call it the Old Northwest? Does anybody have any ideas? Carter.
It's no longer the Northwest anymore because after Lewis and Clark, they had a new definition of Northwest.
That's a really good point. We had made claim to all this land, right? This line right here is the Mississippi River. We had laid claim to all that land, and then we got the Louisiana Purchase. What year was the Louisiana Purchase?
1805.
Like 04, 05.
Yes, somebody got it. 1803. So 1803, and then after that we have all this territory right out here, right? So this is no longer Northwest. This is Northwest. And now what do we call Northwest? Which way should my finger move?
West.
Right. Perfect. So the Sauk and the Fox were a couple tribes that were living in this region. I think your book actually does address that. By the way, just notice that everything that I'm talking about comes right out of the book, guys. So if you're, or right out of the chapter. So if you're familiar with this chapter, by next Thursday, then you're all going to do awesome on the test. So the Sauk and the Fox. Yes, we're going to take. Don't you usually take tests over chapters that you cover?
No.
Oh no? Okay, well we'll throw it out. Then we won't worry about it. The Sauk and the Fox were relocated as well to different portions. They were part of the Indian removal, and not a lot of people realize that. But see, and I think that's pretty much it. I have only left a few minutes for those last couple points for you guys, so please go right ahead. We have Van Buren, depression.
Okay, so I was Martin Van Buren, and since the banks of America, or the Bank of the U.S., so the National Bank had closed, the banks of the state could give out like as much money as people needed, and so they started like, because they were giving out so much money, they started to print paper money that was not backed by gold or silver.
Yeah.
So it didn't have like any value. So that led to super bad 3-year economic depression. And so most days, like 90% of the nation was unemployed, that's not a lot of people working. And then I think it ended in 1830, or no, it started in 1837 and ended in 1840.
Very good. And now, do you guys remember just from this class what we talked about? What were some of the reasons for this panic in 1837? Haley?
Jackson vetoed the charter for the Bank of the U.S.
Exactly.
Closed it.
Closed the Bank of the United States. I think it was actually the second Bank of the United States. But yes, that's what led to this. He was trying to do something good to keep private citizens from profiting off of lending, kind of corrupt lending practices that took place among the citizens. I really need my glasses. What's the last point? Can somebody read for me?
I'm campaigning with lies.
Is that you, Grant?
Yeah.
Go right ahead, Grant.
Okay, so in the election of 1840, the Whigs chose William Henry Harrison, and the Democrats chose Van Buren. And so they started saying things that weren't true about the other candidate, which was called mudslinging. And so they said Harrison was a nice guy who lived in a log cabin, but really he was super rich and lived in a mansion. And then so Harrison won the election, and he died a little bit later, and John Tyler is vice president.
So you guys remember, I don't know, we covered it very briefly, but you remember William Henry Harrison?
He
was Tippy Canoe.
Yep, Tippy Canoe. I know you got some help over there.
No.
I heard you. What was the term that you used, that you brought up, that they used? Mudslinging. Good thing that presidential candidates don't do that anymore, right? That's long in the past, right? Do you think it's gotten better or gotten worse?
Worse.
There's some people who think that I think it's the election of 1828, because you remember the corrupt bargain that we talked about. Henry Clay threw his support and signed behind John Quincy Adams. For a lot of people who think that the election that followed that 4 years later was one of the dirtiest, and I mean they were talking about each other's wives and mothers in ways that nobody ever should. But yeah, it's something that still takes place today. So don't forget that term, mudslinging, because it just, I mean, it's kind of common sense, right? You're throwing mud, it's dirty tactics in order to get elected. So, oh, you know what, guys? There's something I've been meaning to show you. You guys remember, you know we only have a couple minutes here, guys, but you know the symbol for the Democratic Party? What animal symbolizes it?
Is it? It's the elephant. No,
Donkey.
it's the horse.
Donkey.
One of the two.
It kind of sort of looks like a horse. It's a donkey. There's another word for a donkey that we won't use in this class, but hopefully you kind of all get the idea.
Oh my God.
This is Andrew Jackson, and the word that I'm thinking of starts with Jack, as in Jackson. It doesn't end. So they started using. Okay, so they started using this even back in the 1820s in a really derogatory kind of way, right? To make fun of him and talk about how stubborn he was and he had to have it his own way and stuff like that. This actually is what leads to the Democratic Party using the donkey as their symbol. And I was talking to Mrs. Poland about that the other day, and I wanted to make sure that I had it right. So I actually went to whitehouse.gov in order to make sure. I think it's a pretty reliable source. And this is what it says about the symbols. The Democratic Party's first association with the donkey came about during the 1828 campaign of Democrat Andrew Jackson, running on a populist platform by the people, for the people, and using a slogan of "Let the people rule." Jackson's opponents referred to him as a donkey. Much to their chagrin, Jackson incorporated the donkey into his campaign posters. During Jackson's presidency, the donkey was used to symbolize his stubbornness by opponents. So this is where it starts. The elephant starts with Abraham Lincoln, but we will get to that when we start talking about the Civil War. And I think you have like a minute and 43 seconds left. So guys, if you could quick just jot down one thing on a whole sheet of paper. By the way, when I say give me a sheet of paper, it doesn't mean that. Turn in a sheet of paper with your name on it. One point that you're not clear on. It doesn't have to be grammatically correct. You don't have to spell correctly. I just have to know what you're trying to say. Bryce.
Can we use word?
That's perfect. It doesn't have to be a certain size piece of paper. It just has to be a whole piece of paper. I don't want a post-it note. I don't want a gum wrapper.
Something we're having problems with, or something we
Something that you're an idea that you're a concept that you're not fully grasping. That maybe I can make a little bit more clear for you guys. If you understand everything, you don't have to turn anything in. You got it all muted? You didn't have time anyway, guys. Sorry.
What was the bargain that Henry Clay threw?
And it doesn't even have to be a sentence, guys. It can be 2 words. It can be 1 word. I'll get what you're talking about.
Food. Oh my God.
Okay, thank you, guys. Is it going to snow?
Yeah, it's supposed to snow.
It's supposed to snow